This is a brief look at what Nikki Ann Moody and I consider to be one of the foundational works of British science fiction, Jane Webb's The Mummy of 1827. Nikki Ann sadly died in 2019, just as we were starting a critical edition of the novel. Jane Webb, JWL, Jane Wells Loudon, Jane Wells Webb, Webb Loudon, we argue, helped crystallise the idea of the future as a space for fiction. But I am going to be talking about the mummy specifically here. In 2126, a despotic queen ruled Catholic England. The mummy's future setting was almost certainly influenced by Mary Shelley's The Last Man, 1826, the previous year. There, in a fictional future, a new vision of the world takes shape as the narrator cries, "This very hour I will engage a sailing balloon." In Jane Webb's The Mummy, we have the beginnings of a new way of writing this vision. We're in a world of weather control, mobile homes, travelling by rail, steam valets and automaton lawyers. The complicated plot involves the electoral politics through which the next queen is to be chosen, an invasion from Ireland, two brothers with very different ambitions in life, entangled romantic rivalries, hidden identities, Machiavellian plotting, and the mummy of the Egyptian pharaoh Cheops, looming over the guilty with his staring eyes and diabolical laugh. Cheops is revived not supernaturally but through a galvanic battery designed by Dr. Intellect, German design plan or project, making more explicit the hints about use of electricity as a kind of vital fluid in Shelley's first great novel, Frankenstein. And one reviewer, struggling to compare the mummy to something, did turn to Frankenstein. The brief review in John Bull, October 22nd, 1827, concludes that the part of the story involving Cheops would have been very fine had not the conception in some degree been forestalled by Mrs. Shelley's Frankenstein. But if the mummy has less originality in its scenes of terror, it may safely be affirmed that in its comic or burlesque passages it possesses indications of humour of which Frankenstein is entirely destitute. If, as Brian Aldiss argues in Billy Near Spree, Frankenstein was the first novel we can unambiguously call science fiction, we must point to The Mummy to understand how this as yet unnamed mode developed. Among its readers was the horticulturalist John Claudius Loudon. He drew attention to its new and useful combination of ideas in the March 1828 issue of his Gardener's magazine. Impressed, Loudon arranged to meet the author, was surprised to find him a woman, and went on to form an attachment and marry her, or so wrote Jane Webb. Jane Webb Loudon, as she was then dubbed, in 1847. This romantic element is rosily recalled, if not absolutely reworked. It seems likely that Jane Webb's friends, already trying to encourage her career, introduced a couple for their mutual benefit. Webb was a young woman struggling to make a mark in the literary world. She'd just published a collection of prose pieces and poetry. Loudon, already a respected authority with his Encyclopedia of Gardening, 1822, had needed a secretary since the amputation of his right arm. The pair may well have fallen for each other for intellectual and emotional reasons, but there were very practical motives for their partnership. On her marriage in 1830, Jane Webb began a gradual and increasingly involved collaboration with her husband. But she also published under her own name, or rather as Mrs. Loudon, a number of works, including one which is still in print today. Her eventual work promoting women's ownership of the technological and scientific spaces of the suburban garden, and her editorship of The Lady's Companion, in which she encouraged the scientific elements of the female social sphere, is not separate from the playfulness of The Mummy. However, the novel since an 1872 edition, has not seen print since Alan Rauch's 1994 abridgment. For Rauch, The Mummy is a remarkable novel of technological and moral speculation, explicitly expressing the troubled instability of the 1820s. Others see it as a kind of interlude or sidestep towards her important horticultural work. Nicky Ann Moody and I, in our critical edition, argue that, to the contrary, The Mummy is as important a text in science fiction and the establishment of the future as a speculative space as anything by Mary Shelley or H.G. Wells. The most authoritative source for Jane Webb's early background is B. Howe's 1961 biography, written with access to her daughter Agnes's diaries. Jane Wells Webb was the daughter of Thomas Webb, owner of Kitwell House in Berkeley Green near Birmingham, and his wife Sarah, who died in 1819. Father and daughter then toured Europe. On their return in 1820, Thomas Webb found himself in financial difficulties and died in 1824. His daughter's life and literary struggles after this are sometimes a matter of guesswork. She was clearly in London at some point between 1824 and 1827, meeting the editor of the Literary Gazette, William Jerden, who became a kind of patron, mentor to her. Friendship with the artist John Martin and his wife Susan links her to William Godwin, the father, of course, of Mary Shelley. Godwin, however, may not have met Martin socially until 1830. His diary records meeting Miss Webb on 2 occasions in July 1830, once with Martin, and the Loudons on 11th of October after their marriage. There is, however, no evidence that she ever met his daughter. No work by or about Mary Shelley that I've read suggests acquaintanceship with the woman whose work owes so much to her. Most significantly, in the light of many references to her as a teenager when she wrote The Mummy, account of J.W.L's life give her birth date as 19th of August 1807. This is on all the reference books and blue plaques and everywhere. Her death burial register gives her age at death as 57, suggesting a birth date of 1801. Is this an error? Well, other evidence, including her own writing, confirms this, that she was 57 when she died. This weakens the romance of a 17-year-old orphan genius, but possibly allows her more agency in the circumstances of her marriage. Now, The Mummy was a calculated attempt at popular success. In her introduction, she describes her search for literary novelty. The deep mind of invention cannot be worked out. There must be some new ideas left if I could find them. The spirit of her inspiration advises her to embrace the scent of difference, which will come about as new governments, strange discoveries, and stranger modes of life come into the view as you look into the future. This idea that the future is a legitimate area of literary speculation is, as we know, the heart of many forms of science fiction. But she also draws upon more familiar to her audience popular threads in her attempts to make the story a bestseller. One is the discovery of ancient Egypt, with a flood of artifacts from and information about Egypt after the Napoleonic Wars. The Italian-born Giovanni Belzoni brought to London the vast head of Ramesses II, which inspired Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, and the less famous but equally interesting sonnet of the same title by his friend Horace Smith. Belzoni opened an exhibition in May 1821 at which a mummy was unwrapped. This is Horace Smith's response. A silent voice is being allowed to speak for the first time. Almost 2,000 visitors attended the first day. Jane Webb's search for a subject could hardly have overlooked the craze for Egypt, a largely unknown world still open for speculation, before Jean-François Champollion's deciphering of hieroglyphics in 1822. A second thread may be overlooked by today's readers. Rauch notices the background to the accession of George IV, after a long regency, to the throne in 1820, and the controversy over his separation from Caroline of Brunswick, who was not allowed to be his queen. The 1820s also saw bitter arguments over Irish Home Rule and Roman Catholic emancipation. The Mummy's comical Irishman, absolutist Catholic monarchy, and Irish invasion clearly come from the way the author was responding to pressures and anxieties that would be on the mind of her readers. Other ingredients from popular fiction were added: the Machiavellian priest, Father Morris, and his comic foil Murphy, a touch of Shakespearean cross-dressing, and the energetic and attractive heroine Clara, by far the most interesting and positive of the female characters. However, the novel's achievement doesn't lie in its genre tropes. Central to the SF credentials of this weird Gothic romance is its conscious exploration of difference, beginning with the, at the times, innovative future setting. J.W.L's admiration for Walter Scott, whose works still survive, at least in a manner of speaking, in her 22nd century, is partly admiration of a pioneer of the art of attempting to create a plausible past. The future, obviously, is more complicated. It could be dream vision of a technological utopian world. It could be apocalypse. It could be anything in between. The Mummy's future mocks the present, but it reminds us that the future will be different. Like Frankenstein, Edric is afflicted by a scientific hubris, only one step beyond the curiosity involving genuine scientific understanding in the world around the young Jane Webb. Entwerfen's gadgetry is, like the character himself, played for laughs, but its comedy reflects the unsettling effect of actual technology. The topsy-turvy world of plain living aristocrats and jargon spouting commoners is part of the conversation about working class education satirised in things like this, these prints by Paul Pry, March of Intellect, and a poem of the same title published in 1825, in which we hear, "All ranks are so dreadfully wise, common sense is set quite at defiance, and the child for its porridge that cries must cry in the language of science." And even the blacksmith can tell you that iron is hot because it is filled with caloric, whatever that may be. The elaborate and scientific expressions of the vulgar characters like the butler Ambrose are certainly the subject of mockery. Your Honour's words are imprinted upon the mnemonic organ of my brain, and my sensorium must be divided from my cerebellum ere they can be effaced. In other words, I hear you, I'll do what you say. But Jane Webb's use of scientific language, her subsequent career proves, does not undermine useful knowledge and self-improvement. Nor is the aristocracy spared. The comedy includes the introduction of characters such as Lords Noodle and Doodle, who, like Hergé's Dupont and Dupont, Thompson and Thompson in the Tintin albums, repeat each other's dialogue in vain attempts to create meaning out of banality. And finally, the estranging effect of science fiction is shown in the way recent technology, i.e. ballooning, is extrapolated into a normal mode of transport. Now, as we've seen, images involving balloons were common. This is another from George Cruikshank. Whether from The Last Man, the expression cited here, or some other source, ballooning touched the imagination of the teenage Brontes in their juvenile world building. As soon as we'd read this letter, we ordered a balloon, the which, when it was brought, we got into and then steered our way through the air, writes Charlotte Bronte in her 1829 Tales of the Islanders. The coronation procession of George IV of July 1821 featured a balloon ascent, as we can see in this print. In the top right, we see Charles Green's balloon, which used coal gas rather than hydrogen. Almost contemporaneously with The Last Man and the Mummy, London magazine published a weird dream fiction called Aerostatical Speculations over London, in a balloon constructed under the scientific direction of Signor Asmodeus of Madrid, thus adding a sinister continental touch to this new technology. There's even outer space. The idea is that the balloon takes you out of the Earth's atmosphere, and so you can go up and over Egypt, which of course, as Edric points out to Entwerfen, is in a different latitude, so it wouldn't actually work. However, it just shows that these ideas were around. In 1815, the cousin of the novelist Fanny Burney drew but did not publish a journey to the moon, which included a number of these items of equipment. And there's also, of course, what interested John Claudius Loudon, the scientific horticultural items such as the steam mowing machine and the weather control. What impressed John Claudius Loudon was not so much its satire as its speculation. Extravagant and impractical ideas will sometimes aid in forming new, useful combinations. Not, perhaps, as great a tagline as "Extravagant fiction today, cold fact tomorrow," that Hugo Gernsback launched Amazing Stories with in 1926. But nevertheless, the publication of The Mummy and Jane Webb's manifesto-like call for fiction that looks into the future and explores change is certainly as important a moment as Gernsback's, even though few English writers were to follow her example until later in the century.